Hello there. We are so excited to spotlight MiraCosta College in our San Diego Imperial region Guided Pathways Office Hour. Our April theme is designing meaningful meetings for transformational change. And we really love some of the strategic work that MiraCosta is doing this semester. So very excited, glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We want to give you a moment to introduce yourselves as well. So if you could please share your name, position, Guided Pathways role, and your motivation for doing this particular work. We would love to start off with that to get to know you a little better.
All right, I'll start. My name is Zhenya Lindstrom, and I'm the Dean of Instructional Services at MiraCosta, and I'm the Guided Pathways lead on the administrative side. The motivation for my background is in labor market research. I did that for 10 years prior to taking on an administrative role at MiraCosta College. And in career education, we've looked at pathways for a really long time. So that kind of has been my background. So my personal motivation is looking also at the equities and inequities of the labor markets and connecting our programs, making sure our programs are structured and guiding students in a way that is equitable towards economic mobility.
My name is Luke Lara. I am the counseling faculty member here at MiraCosta, as well as the counseling faculty lead for Guided Pathways. And I've been in this work or in this position for about 4 years. The motivation really for joining this leadership team and doing this work is to really keep equity at the center of this work. I saw that Guided Pathways had the potential for really making a wholesale change in the student experience, but without the pressure from within and outside to keep it on track with equity. I knew that I had a role to play and to make sure that we did our work right here at MiraCosta. So I feel like I've played that role. I hope that our successes have resulted because of that as well.
Thank you. Lovely. We are glad to hear from you, and we're grateful that you are willing to share with us. So before we dive in, we do want folks to know that Guided Pathways leaders across the San Diego Imperial region have been doing a lot of researching and planning just brilliant student-facing processes and redesign projects. But we've also heard from folks that there's a need for detailed examples of how to go about implementing ideas. How do I engage a campus-wide community in redesign efforts, and not just engage them, but do it in a way that's truly inclusive and also meaningful for cross-functional stakeholder groups? We think that this is a great example in that type of approach. So what we'll discuss at MiraCosta today is how they've approached their Guided Pathways reflection and future planning.
Thank you. And for our viewers, throughout this conversation, you may hear the term SOAA or SOAA. That acronym stands for the Scale of Adoption Assessment. The SOAA is a reflection and planning tool designed by Columbia University Teachers College's Community College Research Center, or CCRC. And for the past several years, this SOAA tool has been part of our state planning process for a Guided Pathways redesign. While we'll be talking a little bit today about SOAA, we're really focusing in on the how this team made this SOAA planning process a truly meaningful and deeply inclusive process on our campus. And that equitable process piece is something that's really transferable to so many other efforts in what really we were trying to do in transformational redesign.
Absolutely. So to Zhenya and Luke, we're often talking about designing with our end goal in mind to move GP redesign forward. And we'd love to know if you can tell us, what were your intended outcomes as you went through this process and prioritized inclusive engagement?
I'll let Luke start on this one, as he was involved in the beginning of the redesign process.
Thank you, Zhenya. Yeah, for several years, we started this work out of our initial engagement with Achieving the Dream, and then we became part of the first or the wave of 24, the California Guided Pathways, and now we're part of the California Guided Pathways 2.0 project. But throughout this work, pre-pandemic, even gathering as many constituents in the community to be involved in looking at data and in participating in various work groups, getting faculty involved, our classified professionals, administration, students, to really shape our Guided Pathways work. And so from the beginning, we've taken this SOAA reflection process very seriously, have put it through our governance process as well to review. Our academic senate reviews it twice, and then it's goes to our college council as well. It gets a lot of input, a lot of eyes and feedback, but we really love to start with the practitioners, the folks who are heavily involved in trying to implement the Guided pathways framework on our campus, but we also seek broader input. So that's kind of been our approach over the years, but we took a slightly even different approach this year. And so that's what we'll talk about a little bit more. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Zhenya.
Just the fact that MiraCosta made a commitment to focus any of the redesign effort, all of the redesign efforts on our disproportionately impacted student populations, which is Black, African American, Latinx, and adult learner, 25 or older. So the populations. So any redesign work that we do, we frame from the perspective of whatever we're doing. Are we serving students? Are we serving those three student populations? Are we designing for with those three student populations in mind? So when you ask about intended outcomes, the outcome is also to engage our college community in having conversations about the redesign with those three student populations in mind.
And we also try to use guided pathways at a minimum. We use the phrase redesigning the student experience because we want to reframe the conversation around the student experience. And in particular, when we're talking about equity, just as Zhenya mentioned, we identified three student populations that are disproportionately impacted on our campus that we are focusing our efforts around.
Lovely. Thank you both so much for sharing there. That's super exciting, to hold that at the heart of the work that you're designing. Earlier, we heard, and that really connects to the personal motivation for why you're even involved in this work. But we know that doing that inclusive engagement across the community requires a lot of different folks to be engaged. So could you explain some about how you decided on which people, which groups to include in your conversations and in decision making? Basically, how did you go about deciding who to include in this work?
All right, for this year, over the years, like we said, we've been doing this work for about 5 years. And so we've made a lot of progress in pillars 1, 2, and 3. But like many colleges, we really haven't gotten very far with pillar number 4, ensuring students are learning. And so we thought, well, also with the pandemic and COVID and everybody being remote for mostly the last 2 years, we felt like we had lost some of that momentum we had in the earlier years around these conversations, around the reflection in the work groups and all this stuff, that we thought, well, how, aside from professional learning opportunities that we might provide for faculty around the pillar 4, how can we begin to institutionalize some of these things? And in the process of having a conversation with our California Guided Pathways 2.0 coach, Kay McClenny, she helped us come up with a strategy. And the strategy was, let's look at those places where we institutionalize things, right? Our governance committees that have, that create policy procedures around resource allocation, curriculum development, student learning outcomes, right? Education policies. And so we in October had an initial meeting with the faculty chairs as well as administrative chairs of some of these committees to begin that conversation. And we presented kind of where we're at, like up until now, where we're at with Guided Pathways and using the SOAA is a framework. We're at scale at all these things. You can see the artifacts on campus or online of what we've created and what students are now experiencing. But it's pillar 4 where we need your support. And so Zhenya was able to put together a crosswalk between like the different committees and the practices within the SOAA to begin that conversation. To talk about the higher level, like we can do things, in terms of professional development here and there for faculty, but what are the structures that we can change to create, from program review to, curriculum development to resource allocation, a seamless flow that incorporates the Guided Pathways framework and these particular practices that will then result in these particular practices happening at scale.
I would just add that we have this instructional faculty liaison role that is part of our Guided Pathways and part of the success teams. And we realized that a lot of practices they were charged with were in pillar 4, but it's hard for them to make those inroads without having an institutional infrastructure of institutionalized practices first. So that's, and we needed to make that connection and kind of readjust our approach to so it was kind of what Luke explained with that in mind, and thinking of how do we engage folks into meaningful conversation. And they started asking questions. So it was a really, like, in terms of outcome of those initial conversations was they started reflecting of whether or not they fit with what practice. This is what we're already doing that might be contributing to this practice. This is what we could be doing. It was sort of a little bit of brainstorming session we had with some of the committees. Luke also, in the role of the Academic Senate President, asked the chairs and co-chairs of the committees to bring back one or two action items for each of those practices that we've discussed in Pillar 4. So there is this sort of action planning happening in addition to the engaging with information, not just kind of reflecting, but also thinking what is their role in implementing and institutionalizing those practices.
It was also the first time that these players, right, institutional players, have been in the same space to talk about the cross-functionality and collaboration, that could happen. We have an institutional program review committee, we have an outcomes assessment committee, and we have a curriculum committee, and they're all related, but they don't have a connection. They don't have joint meetings. Our budget and program committee and our institutional program review committee, and only began to have one joint meeting a year about 3 years ago. And I remember being the one who instigated that. So it's like, if Guided Pathways is about breaking down silos for students, it needs to be about breaking down silence for us as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm already reflecting, right, on so many of the themes that are coming up from your responses around communication and shared vision and de-siloing, and just how important it is. And I think we're really getting at the nature of this is culture work just as much as it is around redesigning the student experience. Part of that is redesigning the culture of how work is done at MiraCosta. Let's dive a little bit deeper into that one related to this question. So once we had those outcomes in mind that we talked about earlier and got all of these folks to the table, what was the strategy for that engagement? I think we've kind of touched on some of the pieces, but other kind of reflections around the process that you did to be able to facilitate those discussions in a meaningful way.
So every year when we look at our scale of adoption assessment, like Luke mentioned, it is embedded in our kind of procedures that every year scale of adoption assessment goes to the Academic Senate for review and our administrative council and other committees. And it's usually sort of a one-way. We provide a pre-populated template with some of our reflections of what has been completed. And then we receive feedback via comments or emails and then incorporate that feedback. What often happens is there is a really good idea, but we don't have any context for that idea and it hasn't been vetted, hasn't really churned into a more thoughtful idea. So it's hard to just put it in the scale of adoption assessment without having a meaningful conversation and involving others in that conversation. So we piloted this year a slightly different approach to our assessment. So reflection on what we have accomplished in this past year, but also mapping what needs to get done moving forward with each of these practices. Instead of kind of doing that, posting a document, which we've done too, we did post a document and went to the committees and asked for their feedback. But in addition to that, we invited a pretty large group of folks to participate in a guided discussion on our scale of adoption assessment. And we called it Guided Pathways Scaling Up because it's all about scaling the practices. And in communication to the college community that we've invited, we pretty much said, this is going to be your roll up your sleeve type of session. Come with your ideas, with your thinking hats. We want your input based on your role, based on your experience, and something that maybe you're already working on. So we've invited our Guided Pathways 4 leadership was there. We had all the deans were invited, so all of the college leadership was invited, but also the members of our success teams, which included success coaches and counselors and our instructional faculty liaisons. We invited our non-credit folks that are not part of our success team effort right now, but we started having a conversation of building those pathways from non-credit to credit. We've invited students. We really wanted students in each of the breakout spaces so that we could have student voice right there. Work-based learning liaison, career counselors. So pretty much looking and reflecting on all the practices and thinking who's already doing related work on campus. So it's kind of more purposeful, as well as those chairs and co-chairs from the governance committees to be part of that Pillar 4 discussion. So it was more, the format was a 2-hour Zoom meeting with breakouts that took the majority of the time, where folks were given more of a kind of a guided document with questions. We changed kind of prompts a little bit. We had to change the language. If you have been looking at the scale of adoption assessment that comes from the Chancellor's office, probably seen there's some deficit-minded language still in there, and the way that even equity questions are framed up well. That way, we've done some kind of work on changing the questions. I crosswalked each equity question for each of the big pillar areas to specific practice. So we could have a very kind of focused conversation. We start discussion about each practice in the breakout room, what the practice says, what are the equity considerations for this practice, and then at MiraCosta, what have we done to implement this practice and implement this practice equitably? So kind of the reflection piece on the last year's efforts, and then what do we still need to do to move this practice at scale, to implement this practice at scale, or move from either non-systematic to planning to scale, right? So incremental steps, but do that with equity in mind. So it was interesting that in some of those spaces, the discussion happened around the fact that, oh, we've implemented this practice and we rated ourselves at scale last year, but have we actually done it with equity in mind? Have we done it intentionally for equity? So what are some of the actual steps then that are necessary to change that?
Great, thank you so much. And any other kind of visual aids or pieces that might have come up that helped you to really organize this process or communicate it outwards to other folks?
Yeah, I can share my screen and show you the kind of the document that we used for the facilitated discussion. So this is an example of pillar 2 with scale of adoption, the actual scale for, as a reference point. So we introduced the practice. We kind of summarized where we were, highlighted where we rated ourselves for last year, and then provided those equity consideration questions, the progress that we have done up to spring 2021. So this is from last year's assessment. And then question the prompt. These were prompts and these are the notes from that conversation. So all of the previous information was pre-populated. This is new information that came out of discussion within the breakout. So we had a facilitator for each of the breakouts, and they were prompting the group to reflect on these 2 questions. So one was what additional progress has been made in the last 12 months. And then the second one, what steps can be taken toward implementing this practice at scale and who can lead this implementation? And then we continued on, right? So for each of the practices, we did kind of the same template that captured the notes. And we do this a lot. We use Google Docs and have folks contribute notes real time. So we share the links and they're editable. So even later after the discussion, all the participants have access to the shared documents.
So much, yeah. It's the power of being able to work collaboratively on these digital devices and tools and collecting that feedback, both synchronously and asynchronously and in a facilitated manner is just so powerful, I think. And I think we can see this is for the SOAA, of course, using kind of some of the SOAA template questions and then adding on, but I could see it being transferable, right, approach to student equity planning and general conversations, other things happening at the institution, a design team trying to get in and kind of work together, but having really facilitated conversations, shared language, having that time being facilitated in a really meaningful way, being very powerful. So thank you for that. Our next question here is, stemming off of that intentionality of the work that you've really been outlining for us so far. We see many campuses that want to engage in a more inclusive GP redesign process and improve college-wide engagement, but there are so many different ways to go about that. We'd love to know, how did this approach work for your group? And as a follow-up for that, what did you learn approaching the work in this process? And then afterwards, we can talk a little bit about what you might see for the future.
Well, we've kind of been talking about 2 different things here. So I'll just talk about the governance piece. And that is that, I told you that we started with the initial conversation with the leads in the fall. We didn't know what to expect in terms of the response, but it was very positive. And one of the things that we did after that was to set up an opportunity to go to each of those different committees, either Zhenya and I, or myself and Tao, or some combination of the leads would go to these meetings, do a mini presentation, but really facilitate a conversation among the committee members. So that was great. I would definitely encourage us to do that, maybe even on an annual basis. But one thing we didn't start doing right away is we mentioned that we are asking them to come up with 1 or 2 action items. We didn't start with that approach because we didn't know how the response would be, but at the same time, it does seem a bit overwhelming. And so to help people focus on, okay, what can we do? Because as we know, governance work is very slow moving at times. If we could just identify 1 or 2 things that they have, after the conversation, can make a connection with, what resonates with them. And let's just start there. And, just letting them know that we've been on this journey for many years and they probably participated in some way, but this is a new conversation in terms of institutionalizing through governance work. And so, so it's something that's going to be long term, and we need to continue being intentional about it. That's what I've said that we've learned about it, and we just had a meeting this morning about following up on that.
So from the scale of adoption assessment process, I think one of the learnings for me is I didn't expect that many people to show up. We had 49 participants at one point of the Zoom meeting. I thought everybody was already fed up with all the requirements we have to meet, just to check the box. And I think it's important for folks to feel like they're providing meaningful input, and we're not just doing it to check the box. For us, and it is on us, is to continue to facilitate those next steps, to create that follow through. That we didn't just, get together for 2 hours, collected their input, and put that document on the shelf, or rather in Nova. That it is a meaningful document, that a living document that we continue to look at, reflect, and make changes to, and plan our actions based on that. So I think that now with the governance, sort of that effort that Luke described, we're creating that meaningfully, that connection. So our scale of adoption assessment, those practices, we don't just look at them once a year. We are continually looking at them and seeing sort of where these things are happening at the college, what department we need to connect with, what governance structure we need to connect with to make it happen. So I think the biggest learning for me is that you can make it meaningful. And if you open up a discussion, you tell folks, like, we're not going to present to you, just kind of create space for folks ahead of time. And they would be willing to engage with the information. But one of the things that worked really well, and I didn't know how this would go, is for folks to select their own breakout, like to select which breakout they would want it to go to. I did a little bit of kind of briefing what each pillar is. And then everyone just selected the breakout they wanted or felt like their work aligned better with. And the resulting composition of each breakout was sort of where I would think people would go naturally, based on their role and history with the institution. So that actually worked out really well.
You both so much, and I'm just kind of reflecting on some of the themes that came up from today's conversation and what I was hearing. So the importance, right, of meeting people and making sure to have those communication lines wherever they are at on your campus or in your institution, going out and really facilitating those conversations to get people in the loop, but also part of that shared visioning and decision making, helping to prioritize and clarify things with people. So that the idea of really distilling to those action items and steps that people can really focus and center on and not get overwhelmed by. Having shared conversations and dialogues, and power of having collaborative tools to work together, both synchronously and asynchronously. And this inclusion and working collaboratively is a huge draw, right? It brought in more people than you expected, and people really wanted to work in this style and format, and the ability that that can have to potentially change larger college culture. And just kind of reflecting on how does this tie in and make it meaningful for people? How do they see their connections? And creating these spaces and facilitating those conversations can really help do that. And the power of making sure we create spaces and give people options and what gravitates you, what pulls you towards this work, what you care about, and having those options for people to really engage and be part of that work at that level. So thank you so much. Learned so much from you today, and I'll turn it over to Symone to wrap us up.
Absolutely. I would just second that big thank you. We not only admire the work, but we appreciate your willingness to share it, because we're all really deeply entrenched in this work, and being able to see examples of, centering equity and naming it and embedding it into the inclusive tools that you're using as you bring people across your campus to engage is just beautiful to see. So thank you for bringing your insights. And we want to let you know our region appreciates it. We appreciate it. And we absolutely wish you and your students and your entire campus community the best as you continue to move forward in this work.